The flowers on her wedding dress were already wilting. Alice noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly, without drawing attention to herself, her eyes dropping to the cream-colored petals sewn into the hem of her gown as she stood in the narrow corridor outside the great hall. The lavender sprigs that the seamstress had stitched with such care 3 weeks ago had browned at the edges overnight, as if the fabric itself had decided to mourn before she did. She pressed her fingertips against one of the petals. It crumbled. She told herself it meant nothing. The hall beyond the carved oak doors smelled of pine resin and melted candle wax, of roasted meat, and the heavy perfume of the noble women seated near the fire. Alice could hear their laughter from where she stood, bright, effortless, the kind of laughter that belonged to women who had never once been told they were lucky to be chosen. She smoothed the front of her gown with both palms, a habit she had never been able to break, and reminded herself that this was a good day, that she was grateful, that Devon Ashford had looked at her, plain, Omega-born Alice Voss, daughter of a minor lord with no wolf, no rank, and no particular beauty worth mentioning, and had chosen her above all others. That was what her stepmother had said, every single morning for the 4 months of their engagement. He chose you, Alice. Do not forget what that means. She hadn't forgotten. She had worn it like a stone tied around her neck. The doors opened before she was ready, and the warmth of the hall rushed toward her like a wave. Hundreds of candles burned in the iron chandeliers above. The long tables were lined with guests, dressed in wool and silk, in deep greens and burgundy, and the dark blue of the Ashford house colors. Heads turned. She felt every gaze as a kind of pressure against her skin, assessing, measuring, dismissing. She was used to that. Being Omega in a world built for shifters meant learning to become very small, very still, and very unobtrusive. It meant learning not to take up too much space in a room that was never really meant for you. She walked the length of the hall with her chin level and her hands clasped in front of her, because that was what she had practiced, and because she could not afford to let them see her shake. Devon was waiting at the altar stone. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of handsome face that photographed well in council portraits. Strong jaw, copper-brown hair, the self-assured smile of a man who had never truly doubted himself. Beta-born, but wealthy, influential. Connected to half the noble families in the Northern Territories. He had come to her father's estate on a gray November morning and offered a marriage contract, and her stepmother had wept with relief. And Alice had stood in the doorway of the study, watching her future be arranged by people who loved her in the way that landlords love a well-kept property. He smiled when he saw her. It looked real. That was the worst part, she would think later. It had always looked so convincingly real. The ceremony was conducted by Elder Thomas, a white-haired shifter of the old tradition who smelled of cedar and ink. The words were the old words, the ones that invoked the moon goddess as witness, that asked the stars and the bloodlines to record what was being promised. Alice repeated every phrase in a clear, steady voice. Devon's hand was warm around hers. His grip was firm and dry and certain. She should have noticed then that her instincts were utterly silent, that the place inside her chest where some Omegas described feeling a faint pull, the old ones called it the hollow, the space where a mate bond would eventually settle, was completely, profoundly empty. Not peaceful, empty. Like a room where all the furniture had been removed and the windows nailed shut. But she told herself that was fine. Not every Omega felt it. Not every bond announced itself at a ceremony. The reception stretched long into the evening. Alice sat at the high table beside her new husband, and smiled until her face ached, and accepted congratulations from people whose names she had only just learned, and drank very little of the wine because she needed her head clear. Devon was attentive in the early hours, refilling her cup, leaning close to murmur something clever about the elder's speech, resting one hand briefly on the back of her chair. She felt the eyes of the other women in the hall following that hand. She understood. in the deeply practical way that orphaned Omega girls learn to understand things early, that she had been elevated tonight, that the women watching her were performing a specific kind of envy. She had never wanted to be envied. She had only ever wanted to feel safe. It was past the second bell when Devon excused himself. "Business," he said, briefly. He touched her cheek once before he left, and she watched him cross the hall toward the side corridor, and she thought that she should feel something. Nervousness, anticipation, the particular vulnerability of a wedding night. But what she felt instead was a pulling sensation behind her sternum, low and uncomfortable, like a fishhook lodged just beneath the skin. She waited. Then she waited longer. When a quarter of an hour had passed and the guests around her had grown louder with wine and laughter, she set down her cup and followed, not out of suspicion, out of the same quiet, watchful instinct that had always served her better than any wolf ever could have. The side corridor was unlit. She felt her way along the cold stone wall, her slippered feet silent on the flagstones, and the sound of the hall faded behind her. The hook in her chest pulled harder. She almost turned back. Then she heard his voice. Devon's voice, low and unhurried, and a woman's laughter answering it. A low, knowing sound, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with politics or business. Alice stopped. The corridor was dark, but not completely. A crack of candlelight spilled from beneath a door at the far end, and the voices came from behind it, and she stood perfectly still in the dark and listened to her husband of 4 hours speak to someone else in a tone she had never once heard him use with her. "She suspects nothing," Devon said. A pause. The woman's voice, quieter now. "And the estate? The Voss lands?" "Transfer of title takes place in 30 days. Once it's filed with the Territorial Council, her name disappears from the deed entirely. She'll have nothing to contest it with. She has no wolf, no standing, no allies in the council. And if she causes trouble?" Silence. Then, with a lightness that was somehow worse than cruelty, "She won't. She's not that kind of woman." Alice's back met the wall behind her. The cold stone pressed through her gown like ice against her spine. The hook in her chest wasn't pulling anymore. It had simply gone still, and in its place was something else entirely. A clarity so sharp, it was almost painful. The kind that comes only when every last illusion has been stripped away at once, leaving nothing but the raw, undecorated truth underneath. He had married her for the land, for the Voss estate that she had inherited at 14 when her father died. The northern woodland acres, the mill, the granary, the limestone quarry that Devon's family had been trying to acquire through legal channels for years without success. He had not looked at her across a crowded room and chosen her. He had looked at a parcel of land and calculated the most efficient way to acquire it. And she, plain, grateful, lucky to be chosen, had walked down the aisle and handed it to him. She pressed one hand over her mouth, not to muffle a sob. She wasn't crying, she was thinking. 30 days. She had 30 days before everything her father had left her, the only piece of the world that had ever truly been hers, was signed away by a man who could not even be bothered to make the deception feel real. She pushed herself off the wall. Her legs were steadier than she expected. She turned back toward the hall with slow, deliberate steps, and inside her chest the stillness held. Not peace, not numbness, but the particular cold focus of a woman who has just realized that she has been walking toward a cliff in the dark and has stopped exactly one step from the edge. She would not cry tonight. Not here. Not where any of them could see. She retrieved her gray wool cloak from the hook near the servants' entrance, pulled the hood up over her pale braided hair, and slipped out into the night air. The courtyard was empty. The sky above the castle walls was moonless and dense with cloud. She stood in the cold for a long moment, breathing in the smell of frost and wet stone and the distant smoke of the kitchen fires. And she thought about her brother, Eli, 4 years younger, sent to a shifter academy in the Western Territories 2 years ago on Devon's insistence. his tuition paid through funds that Alice now understood had never been generosity. She thought about the look on Eli's face the last time she had seen him, the way he had held her hands too tightly at the gate. Something feels wrong, Alice. I don't like him. She had told him he was being protective. She had told him Devon was a good man. The frost crept through the thin soles of her slippers. She had no coin, no horse, no wolf, no ally within 2 days' ride. She was standing alone in a dark courtyard in a wedding dress with wilted flowers, and every decision she had made in the last 4 months had been made inside a cage she hadn't known was a cage. She pulled the cloak tighter, and then she started walking. She walked until the castle lights disappeared behind the tree line. The northern road out of Ashford territory was not a road so much as a suggestion. 2 wheel-worn tracks pressed into the earth by decades of cart traffic, separated by a ridge of frost-stiffened grass that caught at the hem of Alice's gown as she moved. The cold was serious now, not the decorative chill of an autumn evening, but the kind that worked its way through wool and linen and settled into bone, that made the fingers clumsy and the thoughts slow. She kept her arms crossed tight against her chest beneath the cloak and focused on the sound of her own footsteps, because focusing on anything else, on the voices behind that door, on Devon's hand warm against her cheek, on her stepmother's voice saying lucky to be chosen, would stop her legs from working. She did not know exactly where she was going. She knew only the direction. Away. The forest closed around her within the first mile. Pine and oak, the branches knitted together overhead so thickly that even the faint starlight disappeared. The smell of the woods was deep and cold, resin, wet bark, the faint mineral trace of a stream somewhere to her left. She had grown up on forested land. Her father had walked her through the Voss woodlands every autumn of her childhood, naming trees by their bark, teaching her to read the ground. That knowledge felt very distant now, separated from her by 4 months of soft carpets, and arranged dinners, and the slow, careful work of becoming someone's wife. She stumbled on a root and caught herself against a trunk, her palm scraping bark. She held still for a moment, breathing. Think, she told herself. Don't feel. Think. The territorial road to Coldfen village was roughly 4 miles north. From Coldfen, she could reach the way station where the courier routes intersected. A rough place, half inn and half storage depot, but populated enough that a lone woman could hire a seat on a transport cart without drawing excessive attention. From there, 2 days east lay the city of Varneth, where her father's old solicitor still kept an office, where the original land deed, her father's deed, bearing his seal and her name, was filed in a locked cabinet that Devon had not yet had 30 days to reach. It was not a plan. It was a direction, but a direction was enough for now. She pushed off the trunk and kept moving. She heard the horse before she saw it, the irregular rhythm of hooves on frozen ground, moving too fast for the road conditions, coming from behind her. Her first instinct was to step deeper into the tree line, and she obeyed it without thinking, pressing herself behind the wide trunk of an oak and pulling the gray cloak around her. Through the branches she could see the road, a pale gray strip against the dark earth, and then the horse appeared, a dark animal, no lantern, ridden hard by a figure she recognized by the particular angle of his shoulders. Cade, Devon's younger brother, Devon's loyal, obedient, entirely unimaginative younger brother, who had smiled at her warmly at every dinner, and whose warmth she now understood was the warmth of a man watching a transaction proceed smoothly. He rode past without slowing. She waited until the sound of hooves faded north, then stepped back onto the road and turned east instead, cutting off the main track into the thinner deer paths that wove between the trees. It added distance. It reduced risk. She made the calculation in the space of 3 breaths and moved. The cold deepened as the night wore on. Her slippers had soaked through within the first mile, and her feet had progressed from painful to numb, which was either a mercy or a warning she no longer had the body heat to process. The gown was wrong for this, too fine, too thin beneath the cloak, designed for candlelight and admiration rather than forest floor and November air. She tore the embroidered hem off at the knee as she walked, using the fabric to wrap both hands when her fingers stopped responding properly to her instructions. She did not stop. Stopping felt like surrender, and surrender felt like dying, and she was not willing to do either. It was somewhere in the second hour that she heard the second sound. Not hooves this time. Something else. Low, rhythmic, wrong. A sound that didn't belong to the wind or the trees or the natural voice of a cold forest at night. She slowed, tilting her head, trying to locate it through the darkness. A groan. Human. Or close enough to it. She stood on the path for a long moment, listening to the voice in her head that said, "Keep moving," and the older, quieter instinct that said someone is hurt. These had always been the two competing authorities inside her. The learned caution of a woman who had been overlooked and underestimated her whole life, and the stubborn, inconvenient conscience that her father had cultivated in her before he died. "You don't look away from suffering, Alice," he had told her once. "Not ever. That's the one thing I'll hold you to." She turned toward the sound. 20 feet off the path, half hidden beneath the overhang of a fallen pine, she found him. He was on his side, one arm braced against the frozen ground, the other pressed against his ribs. Even in the near-total darkness, she could see the dimensions of him. Broad, heavily built, the kind of physical presence that didn't diminish even when horizontal and clearly in pain. He wore dark leather armor, cross-strapped, with the distinctive wide belt of a ranked warrior, and a fur-lined manto that had been pushed partially aside. His hair was braided back in thick, dark plaits that had come partially loose, falling across his face. His eyes, when they opened and found her, were in startling pale blue, the color of glacier ice, vivid even in darkness, and carrying in them an expression she had not expected. Not aggression, not confusion. Clarity. Absolute measuring clarity, even through obvious pain. "How many?" he said. His voice was low and controlled, the voice of someone who had learned long ago not to waste energy on volume. She blinked. "I'm sorry? How many of them followed you onto this road?" It wasn't a question about her. It was tactical. He had already assessed her direction, her pace, her state, and deduced that she was being pursued. She stared at him for a moment, thrown entirely off the script she had been composing in her head for a conversation that she had imagined would begin with, "Are you all right?" "One that I saw," she said. "Devon's brother. He took the north road." The man with glacier eyes absorbed this, then shifted his weight and immediately went still again, jaw tight. The arm pressed against his ribs. She could see it now, the way the leather was darker there, the wrong kind of dark. "You're bleeding," she said. "Observant." She should have left. Every reasonable, self-preserving instinct she had developed over 23 years of being the least powerful person in every room told her to note the situation, wish him well, and continue moving east toward Varneth and the solicitor's office, and the only chance she had of keeping her father's land. She had nothing to offer an injured stranger. She had no wolf, no healing gift, no medicines. She had torn fabric wrapped around her hands and numb feet, and a 4-month marriage that had lasted approximately 6 hours before it fell apart. She knelt down beside him anyway. "Let me see," she said. He looked at her for a moment, that clear, measuring look that seemed to take inventory of things she hadn't said aloud, and then moved his arm aside. The wound was below the ribs, on the left side, a deep cut that had been partially dressed with what appeared to be a strip of his own undershirt, already saturated. Not fatal if treated. Potentially fatal if ignored on a frozen forest floor until morning. She unwrapped the fabric from her hands. Her fingers were clumsy with cold, but functional enough. She pressed the cleanest section against the wound and held steady pressure. And he said nothing, did not flinch, only watched her face with that unnerving steadiness. "You should not have left the road," he said, after a moment. "I had reasons. The man following you. Among other things." A pause. The forest was very quiet around them, just wind through pine needles and the distant sound of the stream. She could feel warmth returning to her fingers from the heat of his skin, which meant his body temperature was still high. Good. His color, from what she could see, was not alarming. His breathing was controlled. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It sounded like an observation rather than a question, and it carried a faint undercurrent of something she couldn't quite name, not surprise exactly, but a quality adjacent to it. As though he had expected something and found something else instead. "I don't have the energy for fear right now," she said honestly. "I've used most of it up this evening." Something shifted in his expression then, very small, barely visible, but real. The faintest softening at the corner of his mouth, gone almost before it appeared. "There's a way station," she said, "northeast of here, past the ridge. If you can walk, or if I can walk." "You were lying on the ground." "I was resting." He said it without inflection, and she could not tell if he was serious or if that was his version of humor. She decided it didn't matter. She helped him to his feet. He was significantly taller than she had estimated from the ground. A full head above her, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the surrounding forest feel slightly smaller. He steadied himself against the fallen pine for exactly 2 seconds, then stood on his own and adjusted the cross straps of his armor with the methodical efficiency of someone who had been hurt before and knew how to work around it. He looked at her. She looked at him. The wind moved through the trees above them. "Orion," he said. "Just the name, nothing else." She pulled her cloak straight. "Alice." He nodded once, as though confirming something he had already suspected, and then he gestured for her to lead. And she turned east toward the ridge and the way station and whatever came after that, and she did not yet know, could not have known, standing there in a ruined wedding dress, with frost on her hem, and another woman's borrowed name still ringing in her head, that this man walking quietly behind her through the dark was the reason everything was about to change. She only knew that he had not asked her why she was running, and that, after everything that had happened tonight, that felt like the most decent thing anyone had done for her in months. The way station at Cold Fen Ridge smelled of horse sweat, burned tallow and old straw. It was a low building of rough-hewn timber and river stone, crouched at the intersection of 3 courier routes like something that had grown there rather than been built, organic, utilitarian, indifferent to comfort. 2 transport carts stood in the yard outside, their horses blanketed and tied. A lantern burned above the door. Alice pushed it open and felt the blast of interior warmth hit her face like a physical thing, and for a moment her legs simply stopped working properly, and she had to grip the doorframe. Orion's hand closed around her elbow. Steady, brief, gone the moment she had her footing back. She did not acknowledge it. Neither did he. The common room held 6 people, 2 cart drivers sleeping across their arms at a corner table, a woman in a traveling dress who looked at them and then looked deliberately away, and 3 men near the fire whose conversation stopped when the door opened. Their eyes moved to Orion, the way all eyes moved to Orion. She was realizing, not with recognition necessarily, but with the involuntary animal alertness of shifters registering something significantly above them in the hierarchy. 2 of them looked away within seconds. The third held a beat longer, then returned to his cup. She felt none of that. She was Omega-born, without a wolf, her instincts blunted in all the places that shifter society considered most important. What she felt instead was the warmth of the fire and the smell of something edible on the cook stove and the specific, grinding exhaustion of a body that had been running on fear and cold and had now, in the presence of 4 walls and a roof, decided it was safe to start sending damage reports. She found the woman who ran the station in the back room, heavy-set, gray-braided, entirely unsurprised by late arrivals in various states of dishevelment. Alice paid for 2 rooms with the small purse she had kept sewn inside the lining of her cloak since the age of 14, a habit her father had insisted upon. Always keep something that is only yours, he had told her. Something no one knows to take. Devon had not known about the purse. He had not known about a great many things she was discovering because he had not considered her worth knowing thoroughly. She bought clean linen, a pot of the herb salve the woman kept for working injuries, and a bowl of whatever was on the stove. She paid for a room for herself and left a second coin on the counter without explaining who it was for, and the woman took both coins and said nothing, which was exactly the kind of discretion that way station keepers developed or did not survive in. Orion was in the common room when she returned, seated at the table furthest from the fire, his manto folded across the bench beside him. He had removed the damaged section of his armor. She could see it stacked against the wall with a precision that seemed habitual, and the undershirt beneath was a dark, ruined thing that needed to be replaced. He was looking at the table surface when she sat down across from him and set the bowl and the salve and the linen between them, and when he raised his eyes to her face, she thought again about that pale blue color and how unlikely it seemed on a man who otherwise looked like he had been assembled specifically to intimidate. "You don't have to," he said. "I know." She pushed the salve toward him. "Can you reach it yourself, or do you need help?" A pause. Then, without making it into anything more than a practical admission, help would be faster. She moved around the table. He held still while she worked, lifting the ruined shirt, assessing the wound with the same clear-eyed practicality she had applied in the forest, pressing the salve in and binding the linen tight. His skin was warm beneath her hands. The scar tissue visible across his ribs suggested this was not his first time being stabbed, which raised questions she had decided not to ask yet. He made no sound and showed no expression, only breathed with a controlled steadiness that she recognized as discipline rather than indifference. "This needs a proper healer," she said. "I'm aware. In Varneth I know where the healers in Varneth are." He said it without sharpness, but with a weight that suggested Varneth was not a foreign city to him. She filed that away and said nothing. She returned to her side of the table and pulled the bowl toward her. It was a grain porridge with dried herbs and something that might have been venison stock, simple and hot and extraordinary in the way that only food eaten after hours of cold and fear can be. She ate without self-consciousness, because she was too tired to perform composure, and he watched her for a moment, and then looked away, and the silence between them settled into something that was not quite comfortable, but was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who had agreed, without discussion, to be temporarily useful to each other, without demanding explanations. She was nearly finished eating when he spoke. "The man on the North Road," he said. "He was sent to find you." She set down her spoon. "Yes. You knew when you left." "I suspected." It confirmed itself. He turned his cup slowly on the table surface. "How long do you have before he finds which direction you went?" "By morning. I changed routes twice, but the frost holds footprints." She looked at him directly. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because you helped me. And because whoever sent a man to chase a woman through the forest on her wedding night is the kind of person I find professionally irritating." She stared at him. It was possibly the driest sentence she had ever heard spoken with a completely neutral expression, and she did not know whether to be unsettled or, against every reasonable defense she was trying to maintain, faintly amused. "I need to reach Varneth," she said. "My father's solicitor. There's a land deed that needs to be reviewed. Protected. How many days before the deed can be legally transferred without your signature?" She went very still. "How do you know about the deed?" He met her eyes steadily. "I don't. But you said protected in the voice of someone with a specific deadline, and land deed is the most common instrument used against Omega-born inheritors in the Northern Territories. It wasn't difficult." The fire crackled. Someone at the far table shifted in their sleep. She thought about what it meant that he had arrived at the truth that quickly, without any information, purely from the shape of her words. She thought about the fact that she did not yet know who he was, not really, beyond a name and a wound and the way the other shifters in the room had gone instinctively quiet when he entered. She thought about the fact that she was sitting in a way station at the edge of Ashford territory in a ruined wedding dress, 30 days from losing everything, with a stranger who had already been more perceptive about her situation than the man she had married. 29 days, she said, before Devon can file without my signature. Then you need to be in Varneth by tomorrow evening. I need a cart, or a horse. She glanced at the purse, calculated. I have enough for the cart, not enough for a private horse. I have horses outside, he said. She looked at him. 3 of them, he added. My men will be here before dawn. We were separated when... He paused, the first time she had seen him pause over his own words. When I encountered a complication. The wound, the ambush in the forest. She did not press it. I'm not asking for charity, she said. Good, I'm not offering it. He held her gaze with that same unrattled steadiness. I'm traveling east. Varneth is east. The horses are already paid for and they're going regardless. It was logical. It was reasonable. It was exactly the kind of clean, uncomplicated offer that should have been easy to accept, and she sat with it for a long moment anyway, because the last time someone had offered her something straightforward and reasonable and uncomplicated, it had been Devon, and that had been none of those things. Orion seemed to understand this without being told. He did not push. He looked back at his cup and turned it again slowly and waited, and the patience of it, the absolute absence of pressure, was somehow more disarming than any argument would have been. All right, she said, finally. He nodded once. She gathered the remaining linen from the table and stood. Her legs ached badly now, and her feet, returned to feeling, were making their objections loudly known. She pulled her cloak around her shoulders and turned toward the stairs. Alice. His voice stopped her at the foot of the first step. She looked back. He was still seated, still turned slightly away from the fire, his pale eyes finding her through the dim room with that quality she had noticed in the forest. The quality of actually looking, not performing the gesture of it. You asked if I was hurt, he said, in the forest, before you knew anything about me, before you knew whether I was a threat, a beat. No one does that. She didn't know what to say to that. It seemed both too large and too simple to answer. You were hurt, she said. It seemed like the relevant thing. She climbed the stairs to her room and lay down on the narrow bed in her ruined gown and stared at the low timber ceiling while the fire in the wall hearth burned down to embers, and she thought about Eli and his academy in the Western Territories, and about a land deed in a locked cabinet in Varneth, and about the way Devon had said she won't with that breezy, absolute confidence, as though he had measured her and found nothing capable of resistance. She thought about the look on Orion's face when she had answered him. You were hurt. It seemed like the relevant thing. She did not understand yet what it meant that he had remembered to tell her that. She did not understand what it meant that out of everything that had happened since the wilted flowers on her hem, it was that small exchange, honest, unadorned, free of any agenda, that felt most solidly real. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would ride for Varneth. Tomorrow she would begin the work of taking back what was hers. Tonight she allowed herself exactly 1 full minute of grief for the version of her life she had believed in 4 hours ago. She counted it out carefully, let it move through her chest like cold water, and then she breathed out and let it go. She was not lucky to be chosen. She was not the kind of woman who wouldn't cause trouble. Devon had made a very specific mistake, and she intended to spend the next 29 days making sure he understood exactly what kind. Varneth woke slowly, the way old cities do, reluctantly, in layers, the smell of bread and coal smoke rising before the light did. Alice rode into the eastern gate, just as the morning market was setting up along the main avenue, the vendor stalls unfolding like the wings of tired birds, sellers calling prices in the cold air with the particular hoarse urgency of people who had been at it since before dawn. She had not slept more than 2 hours. Her body knew it in the specific language of aching joints and slow thoughts, and a sensitivity behind her eyes that made the gray morning feel slightly too bright. But she sat straight in the saddle, because Orion's men rode on either side of her. Two quiet, heavily built shifters named Brennan and Colt, who had arrived at the way station exactly when Orion had said they would, before dawn, without drama, with fresh horses and dry traveling cloaks and the unhesitating efficiency of men who were used to unexpected complications and had long since stopped being surprised by them. Orion rode ahead. He had not spoken much since they left the way station, but his silence had a different quality from Devon's silences, which had always carried a faint suggestion that she had said something slightly wrong, and he was being gracious enough not to mention it. Orion's silence felt like weather. Natural. Impersonal. Carrying no opinion of her in it whatsoever. He simply occupied space without requiring anything from the space around him. And she found, to her own mild irritation, that it was one of the least exhausting things she had experienced in 4 months. The solicitor's office was on the 3rd tier of the city, above the merchant quarter, in a narrow building wedged between a cartographer and a wool trader. The sign above the door read, Harwick & Associates, Documents, Estates, Territorial Law. Alice dismounted before Orion could offer assistance, which she noted he had been careful not to do unless she required it, and straightened her cloak. She had borrowed a plain brown one from the way station woman for 2 coins, her gray one too distinctive, and pushed the door open. Edmund Harwick was 60 years old, ink-stained to the elbow, and had the permanently startled expression of a man for whom every new development in territorial law was both surprising and personally offensive. He had served her father for 20 years. When he looked up from his desk and saw her, something moved across his face. Relief, she thought, and then immediately behind it, alarm. Miss Voss, he said, and then corrected himself. Mrs. Ashford, we were not expecting— Don't call me that, she said, and sat down across from him. I need to see the deed. My father's deed, the original, the Voss estate, Northern Territory, filed under Lord Caro Voss, transferred to Alice Marin Voss upon his death. Harwick looked at her. Then he looked past her at the door, where Orion had entered quietly and taken a position near the wall, with his arms at his sides and no particular expression. Who is— A traveling companion, she said. The deed, Edmund. He rose slowly, with the careful movements of a man performing a task he had been dreading, and went to the cabinet at the back of the office. Alice heard the key turn, heard the particular dry sound of old vellum being handled. And then Harwick returned to the desk and set the deed before her. Her father's seal pressed into dark wax at the bottom, her name written in his solicitor's careful hand beneath it. And she put both palms flat on the surface and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Alice Marin Voss, sole inheritor. Undivided right of ownership. When did Devon Ashford's legal representative contact you? She asked. Harwick sat down heavily. 3 days ago, a man named Croft. He presented a preliminary transfer order, signed by your husband, citing conjugal property law under the Northern Territorial Marriage Statutes. A pause. It's legal, Alice. Under those statutes, a husband of legitimate standing has the right to file a transfer without the wife's co-signature within 30 days of the marriage, she said. I know the statute. My father made me read every territorial law that applied to Omega inheritance before he died. He was very thorough. She looked up. What he didn't tell me, because it hadn't been tested yet, was whether that statute holds when the marriage was entered into under fraudulent pretense. Harwick blinked. Fraudulent? He married me to acquire the land. There was no intent of genuine union. I have reason to believe the entire arrangement was constructed to circumvent my ownership through legal means rather than challenge it through the Territorial Council, which he would have lost. She kept her voice level and factual, because she had been composing this argument in her head since the 2nd hour of writing, and she needed it to land cleanly. If I can demonstrate fraudulent intent, the marriage contract is void. If the marriage contract is void, the transfer order has no legal basis. The silence in the office was very complete. Harwick looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him reorganize everything he thought he knew about this situation. And then he said carefully, "You would need evidence of the fraudulent intent. Testimony alone from an interested party, meaning yourself, would not be sufficient. The council requires documentation, or a credible witness of standing." "I know." She folded her hands on the desk. "I'm working on it." It was Orion who spoke then, for the first time since they had entered. He did it quietly, without moving from the wall, his voice carrying the same unhurried certainty that seemed to be the fundamental register of all his speech. "What standing qualifies as credible before the Northern Territorial Council?" Harwick turned to look at him fully, and Alice watched the solicitor's expression change. That same involuntary recalibration she had seen in the way station, the instinctive assessment of hierarchy. Harwick was beta-born and old enough to have developed good instincts, and his good instincts were telling him something significant about the man standing against his wall. "Alpha rank, lord level or above," Harwick said. "Or a council member. Or—" He stopped. "Or," Orion said. "Or a territorial authority, an alpha king, or his designated representative." The room was very quiet. Alice looked at Orion. He met her eyes across the office, and in his expression was nothing she could read as apology or performance. Only the same steady, open honesty that she had been encountering since the forest floor, and which she was beginning to understand was not a strategy, but simply the way he was. "You should have told me," she said. "You didn't ask," he said. "And you needed to make the decision to come here yourself, not because of what I am." She held his gaze for a long moment. The fire of anger was there. She felt it, small and real. But beneath it something else, something quieter and more complicated. He had ridden beside her for 4 hours as a traveling companion, as a man who owed her a debt of basic kindness and was repaying it, and he had not once used his position to make her feel smaller, or more indebted or steered. He had followed her lead into the solicitor's office. He had waited until the exact moment his position became a practical tool she needed, and then offered it without theater. Devon had used what he was to diminish her. He had spent 4 months making her feel that his attention was the most valuable thing available to her. Orion had spent 4 hours making her feel like the relevant person in her own situation. She breathed out through her nose and turned back to Harwick. "File an injunction against the transfer order," she said. "Fraudulent intent. Contested validity of the marriage contract. I need 30 days suspended while the case is built. Alice, the council won't grant a suspension without substantial—" "They will," Orion said from the wall, "if the petition is co-signed by the Alpha King of the Northern and Eastern Territories." A pause that was almost imperceptible. "Which it will be." Harwick picked up his pen. The next 2 hours were the most productive of Alice's life. She sat at that desk and went through every document Harwick had: the original deed, the marriage contract, the preliminary transfer order that Croft had filed, and 3 years of correspondence between Devon Ashford's family and various territorial council members that Harwick produced with the expression of a man who had been waiting for permission to be horrified. The Ashford family had been trying to acquire the Voss Estate's limestone quarry specifically. It sat on a vein of building stone that the territorial expansion projects to the south desperately needed, and the contracts already drafted between Ashford Holdings and the Southern Construction Consortiums were dated 8 months before Devon had first appeared at her father's estate. 8 months. He had been planning this before she had known his name. She read the documents with her hands flat on the table and her face very still, and Orion stood near the window and let her read and did not speak, and did not try to soften what she was finding, and she was grateful for that in a way she could not yet articulate. By the time they left Harwick's office, the injunction had been drafted, the co-signature obtained, and a sealed copy was being dispatched to the Territorial Council by courier. Devon's transfer order was suspended. The Voss estate was legally frozen in her name for 40 days while the fraud case was assembled. She stood on the step outside the office in the cold morning air and looked at the city around her. The market still moving below, the smell of bread and tallow and frost. And felt something shift inside her chest. Not resolution. Not victory. Something earlier than that. The faint, specific sensation of ground appearing beneath a fall. Behind her, Orion descended the steps and came to stand beside her. Not too close. The correct distance for someone who understood the difference between present and imposing. "He told someone you wouldn't cause trouble," she said, without turning. "He was wrong." "Yes." She pulled her borrowed cloak tighter. "He was wrong about a great many things." A pause. The market noise rose and fell below them. "There's more," she said. It wasn't a question. She had been carrying the shape of it since the way station. The knowledge that Devon's fraud was only the surface of something larger, that men who drafted consortium contracts 8 months in advance and sent their brothers on horseback through frozen forests did not operate alone or without institutional protection. "There is," Orion said. And then, after a moment, "Your brother." She turned to look at him fully. His expression was careful and serious, and she understood from the specific quality of his restraint that what he was about to say was going to require all the ground she had just managed to find. "Eli was removed from the academy in the Western Territories 6 days ago," he said, "on Devon Ashford's instruction. His current location is—" A pause. "Not confirmed, but I have men looking." The cold air moved between them. She did not fall apart. She had promised herself, on the forest floor, that she would not fall apart until she had the pieces to put back together. She breathed in the smell of coal smoke and frost, and she felt the anger organize itself inside her chest into something clean and purposeful and entirely without mercy. "Find him," she said. "Yes," said Orion, simply, completely. And that was all that needed to be said. Eli was found on the 9th day. He was being held in a livestock depot 2 miles outside the town of Grayfen, on land that legally belonged to a shell consortium that Harwick, once given the thread, unraveled in less than 48 hours back to Devon Ashford's family name. He was cold and underfed, and had a bruised jaw from arguing with his captors, which Alice thought was entirely consistent with everything she had ever known about her brother. He was 21 years old, and looked at her when Brennan brought him through the door of the Varneth safe house with an expression that broke something in her chest and put it back together simultaneously. "I told you," he said. "You told me," she agreed. She held him for a long time and said nothing else, and he let her, which meant he understood how close it had been. Orion gave them the room. That was the thing she kept noticing about him. The precision of his instinct for when to be present and when to step back. A precision so consistent it could not be accidental. He had lent her his resources, his legal authority, his men, his network of informants across 4 territories, and he had done all of it without once making her feel that she owed him a particular response in return. He did not stand in her light. He did not redirect her anger. He organized it, the way a good riverbank organizes water, not stopping it, just giving it a direction that didn't flood everything in its path. She had been trying, since the way station, to maintain a careful and reasonable distance from that fact. From him. It was becoming harder. The Territorial Council hearing was held on the 14th day, in the council chamber of Varneth's administrative hall. A long room of cold gray stone, with high windows that let in flat winter light, lined with the carved seals of every alpha family in the northern and eastern territories. Alice sat at the petitioner's table in a borrowed wool dress of dark blue, her hair braided back the way she always wore it, her hands folded and perfectly still. Harwick sat beside her. Orion sat 2 rows behind, at her specific request, because she needed the council to see that she was the one making her own argument. Devon sat across the room with his legal representative, a sharp-faced man named Croft, who had spent the first 5 minutes of the hearing attempting to establish that Alice's petition was motivated by personal grievance rather than legal merit. Harwick presented the consortium contracts, the ones dated 8 months before the engagement. Croft objected. Harwick presented the correspondence between Devon's father and 3 council members actively lobbying for the Northern Expansion Act that would have tripled the value of the Voss quarry. 2 of those council members quietly recused themselves. Croft objected again. Harwick presented the deed, the marriage contract, and a written testimony from the way station woman at Cold Fen Ridge confirming that a man matching Cade Ashford's description had arrived before dawn on the morning after the wedding, asking after a young woman traveling alone. The chamber was very quiet by then. Alice spoke last. She stood and she did not raise her voice, and she did not appeal to anyone's sympathy, because her father had taught her that sympathy was a currency that devalued itself in proportion to how explicitly you asked for it. She presented facts. She presented the timeline. She presented the specific language of the Northern Territorial Marriage Statutes and the existing case precedent. 2 prior cases, both obscure, that Harwick had located in the archive, and that she had memorized over 3 nights with a candle burning low, which established that fraudulent intent at the point of contract formation was sufficient grounds for annulment regardless of the ceremony having been completed. She watched the council's senior arbiter make notes. She did not look at Devon. When she sat down, Harwick leaned close and murmured that he thought it had gone well, and she nodded, and she breathed slowly, and she did not allow herself to feel anything yet, because there was still one more thing. The arbiter's decision came 2 hours later. Marriage contract voided on grounds of fraudulent formation. Transfer order nullified. Voss estate returned to sole ownership of Alice Marin Voss. Devon Ashford and his father referred to the Territorial Enforcement Authority for investigation of conspiracy to defraud an Omega-born inheritor, a charge that carried significant consequences under the same Northern Territorial law that Devon had been planning to use against her. Croft gathered his papers with the expression of a man who had known, somewhere around the consortium contracts, that the day was lost. Devon looked at her across the room as he stood to leave. She had expected many things from that look: anger, contempt, the cold indifference of someone who had never considered her a real opponent. What she had not expected was the faint, specific shock of a man who had genuinely not believed she would do it, who had measured her and been wrong and knew it now, with the full weight of what that wrongness had cost him. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to make the point. Then she looked away, because he was no longer relevant. Eli was waiting outside the chamber with Brennan, sitting on a stone bench eating something from a cloth wrap, with the focused appreciation of someone recently deprived of regular meals. He looked up when she came through the door, and read her face in the instant way of people who have known each other since childhood. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He stood and offered her the second half of whatever he was eating. She took it. They stood in the corridor together in companionable silence while the council chamber emptied behind them, and she felt the strange, specific lightness of a weight that has been carried so long it had started to feel like part of the body, and had now simply stopped. It took her a moment to recognize it as the absence of fear. Orion found her in the corridor an hour later, after the formal documents had been signed and witnessed, and Harwick had gone home with the sealed copies pressed to his chest like holy texts. The safe house had been vacated. Brennan and Colt had already begun the process of returning the horses, settling the accounts, preparing for whatever came next. Orion stood at the end of the corridor with his mantle over one arm, and said nothing for a moment, and she looked at him in the flat winter light coming through the high window, and thought about the forest floor, and the way station, and the ride to Varneth, and 14 days of watching a man make good on every quiet, uncomplicated thing he had offered without ever asking her to be grateful on a particular schedule. "Your side," she said. "Is it healing?" "Yes." A pause. The healer here was competent. Good. The silence settled between them. It had a different quality now from the silences of the first days, less the silence of 2 careful strangers, and more the silence of 2 people who had run out of reasons to pretend they weren't paying close attention to each other. "You're going back north," she said. It wasn't a question. "Eventually," he said. "There's no urgency this week." She looked at him for a moment. "That's not something the Alpha King of the Northern and Eastern Territories says without a reason." No, he agreed. It isn't. She had known, somewhere around the fourth day, what he was to her. The knowledge had arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet settling. The hollow in her chest, the one she had described to herself since girlhood as empty, filling slowly with something warm and steady and entirely unlike anything she had felt standing at that altar. She had kept it at careful distance because she had been wrong before, in ways that had cost her nearly everything, and because the word mate carried 4 months of contamination that she had not yet fully cleaned away. But she was discovering, no longer the woman who stood in corridors waiting for other people to make decisions about her life. "I need to go to the estate," she said. "My father's estate. I need to see it, make sure it's been properly maintained, speak to the tenants, review what Devon's people may have interfered with in advance of the transfer." She paused. "It will take some time." "Yes," he said. "It will." "You could come," she said. She kept her voice even and her eyes on his face. "Not because of what you are, because of who you've been these past 2 weeks. Those are different things, and I want you to understand that I know the difference." Something moved in his expression, deeper than the small softening she had seen at the way station. Something that had been held carefully in reserve and was now being allowed, quietly, to exist. "I know you do," he said. "That's why I'm still here." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked toward the window and the cold gray sky beyond it, and breathed in the smell of stone and ink and the distant market. And she let herself feel, fully and without management, the specific and profound relief of trusting someone and being right. They rode for the Voss estate the following morning, Alice and Eli and Orion, with Brennan and Colt behind them, and Harwick's sealed documents in the saddlebag, and the winter light thin and clear across the northern road. The estate appeared over the ridge at midday. The old stone house, the dark line of the woodland, the quarry outbuildings pale against the hillside. Exactly as her father had left it. Exactly as it had always been. She stopped her horse at the top of the ridge and looked at it for a long time. Eli pulled alongside her. He did not say anything, which was unusual for him, and she glanced over and saw that he was looking at Orion, specifically at the way Orion had stopped a few feet behind her without being asked, giving her the view and the moment without inserting himself into it, and that her brother's expression was the particular expression of someone updating a prior assessment. "All right," Eli said quietly. To no one in particular. "All right." She smiled. It was small and real and uncomplicated, and she turned her horse down the ridge toward home. In the months that followed, the investigation into Devon Ashford and his father exposed a network of fraudulent acquisition schemes affecting 6 other Omega-born inheritors across the Northern Territories, all of them women, all of them selected for their isolation and their lack of wolf rank. Devon was stripped of his territorial standing and barred from council proceedings for life. His father paid reparations to 4 of the 6 affected families, the only currency the territorial authority accepted in lieu of imprisonment for men of his particular class. A compromise that Alice recorded in her own ledger as incomplete justice, which was the only kind the world tended to offer, and which she accepted without pretending it was more than it was. Cade Ashford, to the surprise of very few, had known everything and said nothing, which the territorial court determined was sufficient grounds for its own set of consequences. Edmund Harwick retired the following spring, having described the fraud case as the most professionally satisfying work of his 40-year career. Alice hired his daughter to manage the estate's legal affairs going forward, which Harwick considered an entirely acceptable form of succession. Eli finished his education, eventually, at a different academy in a different territory, and came home for long stretches and argued cheerfully with everyone, and learned the quarry operations from the ground up because he said he wanted to understand what had been worth so much to so many people. He was, Alice thought, going to be formidable when he grew into himself. Their father would have been unsurprised and insufferably pleased. Orion stayed. Not always in residence. He was alpha king of 2 territories, and the administrative weight of that was real and constant, and required his presence in places that were not a limestone estate on the northern ridge. But he came back. Reliably, without theater, in the way that she had come to understand was simply how he moved through the world, with intention and without excess. He learned the names of the estate tenants. He helped Eli with the quarry surveys on 2 separate occasions, without mentioning that he had engineering knowledge that made him probably more qualified for the task than anyone they could have hired. He sat with her in the evenings in the old library that smelled of her father's pipe tobacco and beeswax candles, reading or working in the companionable silence that had been their first real language. The mate bond settled fully on a winter evening 10 months after the night on the forest floor, in the library, with snow falling outside the tall windows and the fire burning low, and Eli's boots audible on the floor above. It did not arrive as a thunderclap. It arrived as a certainty, warm, deep, voluntary in every sense that mattered. She looked up from the document she was reading and found Orion watching her with that pale, attentive gaze, and she understood that she had been choosing this for months, one small, deliberate choice at a time, and that the sum of all those choices had become something neither fear nor doubt could reach anymore. "You knew from the beginning," she said. "In the forest." "Yes," he said, "and you waited. You needed to arrive at it yourself. Anything else would have been—" He paused, in the way he paused when he was selecting the precise word. "Insufficient." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the snow fell past the window in slow, indifferent curtains. The candle on the table between them burned straight and clean. "All those women," she said, "who wanted to be me. When I was Devon's wife, standing at that table." She shook her head slowly. "They wanted the wrong thing entirely." "Yes," he said. "I was only ever asking if you were hurt," she said. "I wasn't asking for any of this." "I know," said Orion. And then quietly, with the complete and undefended honesty that was his most essential quality, "That's exactly why it's yours." She reached across the table and set her hand over his, and the fire held, and the snow fell, and the estate that had been her father's and almost someone else's breathed around them in the winter dark, hers, fully and finely, in every way that the word had ever meant. And that was enough. That was everything.